got it. Bloody hell.
Didn't know we made a documentary.
No,
Is that
we're
just-
live
is that-
streaming it.
Yeah, is he that vain, is he?
We're live streaming it.
Mm. Oh, live streaming.
To about 3 people.
Ah,
We're still in
Well,
test.
so you won't get nude women running across the street.
And 1 Eskimo.
Well, you might do, but you wouldn't be around here if they did. Yeah.
Ah,
So what do you need?
I've got the VGA,
right there.
and it's a question of where it goes. The spring goes blank, but then that's because it's not switched on. No, it won't screw it. There's no screw. No, that's
Have
on.
you haven't got an HDMI?
No, there's no HDMI.
So,
Is this a public library?
It is
Oh, is it?
a charitable library.
Right.
so what do you, what's the problem?
Well, the problem is that this isn't going anywhere. It presumably goes to switch this on, and this isn't switched
Oh,
on.
right.
So I'm not quite sure. If you
There's a remote somewhere.
remote's not here. You just take us through the switching on process.
Just press the blue button, point it sort of vaguely at it,
Yeah.
and it comes on.
Ah,
It takes a bit of time.
it's warming up, yeah. Now, in that case, I should, in that case, I'll take this off and put it onto multiple displays. So it's just now is that just waiting to be seen or what? So this goes straight into the beamer. And multiple displays,
Yeah.
right? Multiple displays, great.
So it's got operating mode single display.
Yeah, but that's because I think because it can't yet
Can you spell your
detect the second display. Yeah, that's because that's all the displays it sees. So presumably when this is plugged in, when it detects that there is a single display, it'll probably take a while. Hang on. Right, now that's on the second display now. So if I go
Your
here,
first name, is it? KKU.
right, do you think now, maybe now,
Ooh.
yes, clone
Yeah,
displays.
go clone.
Extended,
Or try extend desktop.
yeah, that should go on.
Or try cloning.
Hang on, it might,
Go.
doesn't like it. I'll try clone.
Someone with choice on it.
I don't get it. I don't get it. Why it doesn't come on there as well.
So the second display is a built-in display, so the primary display is the
I've got you.
it won't apply. So second display is built-in is the second display is the monitor. Primary display is the built-in display,
Yeah, that might work.
and we're going to extend desktop, and then we're going to apply.
Yeah, well done.
Great.
Why is it not on there?
New settings. This. Just do it a second.
Gotcha.
Monitor built-in
One
display.
straight, yeah.
I think you should have gone. Did you go clone?
No.
Try
Right.
clone.
I'll try clone.
Oh, yeah. Professor of Modular Medicine and Genetics and Pathology.
Yeah, that's it.
Okay,
Pathology,
that's
that's really
cloned.
cut people up, isn't it?
Okay, thanks.
Is it? Yeah, isn't it? I'm the one you smile when you say that.
I mean, it's when you are dead, they will find out.
Yeah, you got a dress on here? You live at Canfield Avenue? Was that
No.
was that Scott Hall?
No, that's my workplace.
I've got you, alright.
medical school.
Yeah.
We make 300 doctors every year in America.
I think there's people trying to get in.
Yeah, but they really good.
They are very
You look a bit young in this photo. You need to change the photo, mate.
very optimistic. Someday, very soon, my brother Risto is making my new website. That was done by the university people.
Jesus Christ.
They don't know. Can I ask you one thing?
This is all what you've published?
Can you, I want to make a photograph with this phone. Can you find how I do it?
Right.
I forgot now.
Ah, sugar.
Could you click your fingers in front of that? Yeah, that's good.
I could never click my fingers, but
Right.
Right. Pictures first.
bugger. It's going to have to be clone displays, I think. That's a shame because I was getting it working. The monitor at home.
Could you do it again? Could you do it again?
This is working perfectly, I think. Is that doing anything? I could never click my fingers. I never learned when I was a kid. It's always been a real issue for me. You know, if I could snap my fingers, I'd have been much luckier in my life, put it that way. Damn it.
Right, so all these, recent applications,
Let me show you.
Right.
Let me show you.
Right, you know all these people? You know all these people? Go. Middle one. Oh shit, yeah. Got a picture of a camera on it, It's alright, that's why you're a brainy one. It's right in front of you, isn't it?
Okay, we'll clone the displays. Oh, what a shame.
What is amyloid? Amyloid. What does it mean?
The idea it causes dementia, your brain accumulates protein, which stays there.
Yeah, got one.
It's all one.
How was it?
That's what we are doing.
What's the thing in the middle of your brain? That stores all your knowledge.
That's my microchip.
Yeah. It's in the middle of your brain, isn't it? We're supposed to, well, everyone's got it. Right. Well, this is proven fact. Hey, you're the brain, right? You're the brain, right?
So,
Well,
Richard.
did you know, right? this thing that stores all your knowledge and everything. And you can that can drive. Bigger. Sorry.
Sorry?
That's what. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, sure.
That is you a minute. That is you a minute before. Okay.
Yeah.
So what I'm going to do is just I'm going to just I'm going to send this code to this side.
Store more shit you're going to talk. Store more shit you're going to talk.
Just kind of like,
Yeah, might be good. Yeah, might be good. We'll just go.
my husband has a
It's true. It's true. It's true. We have big emotions. Most cab drivers got bigger bellies. Cab drivers punch. It goes with the job.
You want me to sit down?
So,
Oh, right. There's a lot to this lark, isn't there?
there's always a delay. There's always
Yeah.
a delay.
Okay.
You don't mind taking a photo, you don't mind
No problems at all. Well, we might ask you to later, but it depends how good the photos are. Okay. Sorry? Of course. Yes, as many as you like. There's the Spanish Civil War painting here. This banner here was made by William Morris in the 1880s, part of the Hammersmith Socialist Society, of which he was a member and founder. There's the International Brigade banner at the back, and this library here,
I've seen that one on
you've seen it on demos, no doubt.
documentary on Sky.
Oh, right, okay.
One of those quick half hour. On that. When it come up there, that was the first thing they showed.
I'll do it on here. Yeah.
Haru. I've got it up. Should I stay here, or should I just get Mary down beyond the door? Stay here. Stay here. Yeah. Well, I'm talking now.
I think the delay's about 15 seconds.
Yeah.
15 seconds. I think it always is.
Don't like talking, so.
According to this, you just sat
Right,
down.
well, I've always thought I was advancing my time. Right.
Okay. So just surf you.
Well, this PowerPoint system is a real drag. It's not working terribly well because with multiple displays you're supposed to be able to select between cloning your displays and having an extended desktop. An extended desktop is a bit like a heart bypass operation.
You want to get Mary?
I'll go and get Mary.
I've got a feeling she's gone out.
Ah, well, she's... Yeah, okay. Chris, can you put your email, your plumbing email down on there? Thanks.
left the
Mary,
library.
you left the library unlocked.
Oh,
Well, it's here, so much.
Well, he's here, so am I. We weren't monitoring it. Yeah. There's an additional list here. This is
no,
what.
no,
Those
all of those
people
people are on it.
All right, okay. Sorry?
Sorry? No, it's not.
Chris is here.
Chris is here. We've been trying to set up this system.
Can I just say, it's a magazine there, and they're free, so if you want materials, take some copies, please do.
It's here as well, though. It's here as well.
Oh, no, definitely. Oh, no, definitely.
Send it to this.
What?
This.
I would say both of those from last time.
Same people.
Yeah. Yes, I know.
Simon, Gawain.
Not Simon, no. Martin Levy, not Simon. Definitely not Simon. No. Definitely not Simon.
Raise from the earth.
Hang on, just going to get
So Richard?
Yeah.
Richard, send it to
Yeah.
Gawain. We'll send it to Gawain. Who else?
I don't know. This is really going to be a trial for me, isn't it? A trial.
That's great.
No, it's great. I can't think of anyone else to send it to. Are these emails or phone numbers?
No, emails.
Oh, right, okay.
Oh right, okay.
It's a real time.
It's a real time, isn't it? So no point emailing it to me.
Wasn't.
Yes, sir.
Wasn't.
Yeah.
Can't remember. I was yesterday.
Can't think of anyone else. No, no, can't think of anyone else. Alex, yeah, no, yeah.
He's already paid online. He paid online, didn't he? He paid online. Mark. 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 Yeah. Got him. Keep him alive. Keep him alive. You try to get him. Try to get him.
One last try. Extend the desktop. And hit apply. Nothing. Nothing. Wonder why.
You turn the corner, it's like you're sitting down, there's 5 seconds.
Hey ho. Folks will start even though
Folks will start even though
one or two people I think will be rolling in.
people I think will be rolling in.
Because they're rolling in front. No, they're rolling in
late.
front. Can I just pass this?
Shall I just pass this sheet around?
Irrespective of whether you've
Event
read it from
event
No, I've crossed that
and
then.
emails of people who want
and
to.
emails if people want to.
Go on, sorry.
Well, it's really so that we've got all your emails, that's all. I know you've signed in, but we want everybody's email. We haven't got the Eventbrite things, haven't got the emails on.
Okay, okay. So that will put you on the main
So that will put you on the main
You're on the main
I mean, we don't mind putting us
Go on. Okay, Mary, do you want to kick off or shall I?
And you.
Okay. First, for those who weren't here last week, one of the features, course outline. Who's not got the course outline? Who would like one? Anyone not got it? Right. Okay. One of the
for those who weren't here last week, one of the concrete outcomes of the course is that
editing the next feature of full mark, the very full mark start morning star. And for those who aren't the morning star carries, the morning star carries every fortnight, a full mark class. Some aspect of Marxism. And we thought that what we would try to do is, from this course, produce at the end of each class the bones of the next full marks feature.
Mm-hmm.
And at the start of each course, each class, we would ask you for your comments on that draft, and we would try to incorporate those comments in the final version, which Mary and I will send off to the Morning Star for publication.
If we agree with them.
If Mary agrees, so I go with everything. Sorry. First thing, any comments on the draft on, I forget what it was called.
Historical materials.
On historical materials that was sent out last week. I think it read something like, is Marxism a better form of history, or something similar. Yeah, carry on, just butting.
You should understand.
fourth paragraph down.
Right.
The tiny little bit which says that revolutions result very rapidly.
So I can have a copy of that. Yeah.
That doesn't seem to be the case. It's more like 200 years. Responsive is H-E-I-L-B-R-O-N-E-R, and it's called the Worldly Philosophers, Chapter 2.
Haldron, Worldly Philosophers. Okay, so you're saying the fourth paragraph down. I can't actually.
1, 2, 3. What was it?
Yeah, which side? First or second side? Of
First, second side.
on the second side.
Second side or first? How does
And each of these stages contains internal contradictions which act as drivers of change, in particular struggles between different interests, landowners and capitalists and workers, which lead to strains which are eventually resolved by a relatively rapid, in brackets, or revolutionary, shift to another mode of production and associated socio-political structure.
This kind of argument is very convincing, very expensive examples of the capitalist revolution, capitalist 200 years.
Right.
And
Okay.
I think it's only important, it's only if you believe that you think that revolutions are all or nothing and very quick. If you actually live through them, there's no different point when you find out it's just another stage of war.
Right. I tend to agree with what you've said. What do other people think about that?
The guy who was the worldly philosopher.
Yeah, Heilbronn.
And it's free.
Yeah. Okay. Worldly philosophers. Do people generally agree with that?
I think that more or less corresponds to actually what you were saying. We've got it wrong here, haven't we, Mary? Come on.
Well, revolutions aren't quick. I mean, the Russian Revolution certainly wasn't, because there was a civil war. The English Revolution was a civil war. So it's, yeah, if that's what you're saying, that revolutions... One from one mode of production to another.
Yep.
And it represents commodification. And the movement from feudalism to that was massively resisted because the feudal mind, the feudal consciousness, those sort of things were totally unearthed. The idea of greed is only as recently still existed in the feudal society.
I think that's a different point that you're making. I think what you're saying is that ideologies can have almost a life of their own, and what's sometimes called the relative autonomy of the superstructure. So in other words, an example from last week would be, why does the family still exist, or why does religion still exist? So capitalist ideology permeates, and it did in socialists in the Soviet Union when it was first formed. If that's what you're saying, I completely agree with you. People's minds don't change. Just
the change to globalisation, which was the mercantile capitalists, and what they brought on, which was the commodity capitalists, was actually resisted so hard to actually bring it into the hegemonic system took over 200 years. And the kickback was massive all the way through. And all I'm saying is, if you give people the idea that revolutions, happen overnight, I think people will be very disappointed if they think, it's always a problem staying the course for things.
Right. What I've done here is to delete the words "a relatively rapid or revolutionary shift" to read eventually resolved by a shift to another mode of production to accommodate that. Mary will have to adjudicate on this ultimately, and we'll probably discuss it.
Yeah.
But what do other people think about that? Is that a good point to make? I mean, I think it probably is, that we have this vision of revolutions being sudden and complete, and quite often they're very messy and they're extended. Yeah, is that?
I think there's a difference between a revolution and the change from one mode of production to another, which does take much longer, and the ideas associated with the old mode of production go on and on. But a revolution can be quite quick. It's a change in state power from one class to another, but that doesn't mean the mode of production changes automatically. That takes ages. If that's the point you're making, I agree with you.
Right, okay.
But if it isn't, I don't.
The revolution could be the superstructure changing, not the base.
Well, let's go on to superstructure and base, because it's another issue,
Yes.
and whether it's a useful issue or not is another question, and I want to come to that shortly. But if people agree with that, then we'll modify it, and Mary and I will have a look at this, and the draft that you will hopefully see, not this coming Monday, with a bit of luck, if not, it'll be the Monday after, we'll have that amendment to it. Right, any other thoughts on this draft? Right. Yeah, go on.
Just following on further back a second. Humans have a concept of revolution in motion. So again, that's like the revolution in 1959, but at the same time, it wasn't all done overnight.
Exactly.
It's something that's ongoing. They're under constant attack. They're under blockade. They're being threatened. There's a propaganda war, and they're constantly improving on their socialism, as they will say. So yes, just the concept of revolution being something long in time, and also when it comes to time, they also measure time in terms of how many years of revolution they've had. So year one of revolution was 1959 to 1960. So it's another aspect of how you measure the length of revolution, how many years they've had revolution going on for, 60 odd years now.
I think that's absolutely right. Again, anyone want to come back on that? Right, Mary and I are going to accommodate these, we hope, into a draft which we will send into the Morning Star tomorrow. And you'll see what happens Monday week. No, Monday with a bit of luck. Or Monday week. So are you happy with this, ending each class? And we'll end this class with handing you out the draft for the next full marks article, which will be on Marxism and philosophy, if you think this is a good way to start. Okay, we will. The second question is, last week we decided that the structure of each course would be a relatively brief introduction from one of us. Mary did last week's introduction. And then at a certain point we would break into groups with a series of questions which we think go to the heart of some of the issues that we've been talking about. And we have a series of questions that we'd like to return to in about an hour's time, 40 minutes' time, just for you to feed back to us your thoughts. Were you happy with that? Did it work last week? I mean, I thought it worked actually really, really well. And we had some very, very good contributions from, as it were, from the groups. So if you're happy again, we'll follow that structure. Yeah?
I mean, even if you're not happy with
Even if you're not happy, because we're going to do it. Right, okay. That was unfair. Right, okay. Well, I'm going to kick off with this one. And the theme is Marxism and philosophy. Mary knows a lot more about this than I do. She's been steeped in the actual works, whereas I'm coming from it in certainly a kind of tangential way, because my background is science, whereas Mary is a historian, and Mary knows much more about science and economics than I do. But I've cleared this with her. So anything that's wrong or you disagree with, it'll be Mary to come back. And I've got to see if this works. There we are. So here's my first quote. I did my first degree in botany. I did undergraduate philosophy, which in 1964 was not easy to couple with a science degree, and the introductory text that we started with was Bertrand Russell's Problems of Philosophy, 1946. And his first chapter is called Appearance and Reality, and the last sentence of that first chapter reads, does the table that I'm sitting on correspond with does the table that we sit at correspond to what we experience with our senses? Doubt suggests that perhaps there is no table at all, that I'm not sitting at a table, that we should be doubting as philosophers. And the last chapter of the book and the last sentence reads, philosophy is to be studied not for the sake of any definite answers to its questions, since no definite answers can as a rule be known to be true, but rather for the sake of the questions themselves. And above all, because through the greatness of the universe, which philosophy contemplates, the mind is also rendered great and becomes capable of the union with the universe, which constitutes its highest good. Okay, that was my introductory text of philosophy. I took that on board at the time, because I didn't know much better, till I met with Marxists who said it was a load of tosh. And the reason it was a load of tosh was, they said, because it was idealism. And that doesn't mean that Bertrand Russell, who's probably Britain's most prominent recent normal philosopher, non-Marxist philosopher, I'd be careful what I say, that doesn't mean that he didn't have ideals, or that we don't have ideals, or it doesn't mean that he didn't want to change society, because Bertrand Russell certainly did. He went to prison for direct action, for nuclear disarmament. He opposed the US war in Vietnam. He was a massive campaigner for civil justice and rights. But his philosophy, in the last analysis, was based on idealism. The notion that ideas were primary and not necessarily related to social structures. In contrast to which, I want to suggest that Marxists have, before anything else, the fact that they're materialists. They believe, and certainly I believe, that ideas can't exist independently of people. Engels said at Marx's grave, when Marx was buried, that just as Darwin discovered the law of development of organic nature, there's some typos in here, so Marx discovered the law of development of human history, the simple fact hitherto concealed by an overgrowth of ideology that humankind must first of all eat, drink, have shelter and clothing before it can pursue politics, science, art, religion, etc. And that therefore, and I think this is the critical part of what he said, the production of the immediate material means and consequently the degree of economic development attained by people during any given epoch form the foundations on which the state institutions, the legal conceptions, arts, and even the ideas on religion of the people concerned have been involved, and in the light of which they must therefore be explained instead of vice versa, as has hitherto been the case. Yeah? And if you want to follow any of these up, there's the little full marks question and answer, which is online. and at the end of this meeting, some of that Mary and I have put into the question and answer for the next full marks to appear in the Star. I think there's an issue about the word materialism, because in common language, materialism means preoccupied or concerned with material things at the expense of values and ideas. And I certainly wouldn't want to suggest that Marxists are short on values or short on ideas. Marxists are, I think, idealists, but their philosophy is not idealism. Yeah? Their philosophy is not an idealist philosophy. So I would suggest that the basis of materialism is that, in philosophy, that the world, the universe, nature actually exists, that all phenomena, including consciousness, are related to and the outcome of, although importantly not reducible to material processes, things in the world. And at least in principle, humans can work towards an understanding of that world, usually incompletely, never completely, but over time we collectively begin to gain a better knowledge of what that reality is and how it functions. And if you want to stop me on any of these, if you disagree, feel free to shout out. Yeah? But I'm assuming that those of you who've gone into any kind of Marxist philosophy will take that probably as a starting point. It's not materialistic in the terms of the common use of the word. It doesn't mean, quotes, the philosophical belief that nothing exists beyond that which is physical, which I got from Wiki Dictionary online. And it doesn't mean, certainly, that what we perceive with our senses and reality, whatever that reality is, are identical. And Marx, one of the statements of Marx relating to this in Capital, is that all science would be superfluous if the outward appearance and the essence of things directly coincided. And it's part of science to reveal that inner nature of reality.
Why did you say Marxists are idealists? I wouldn't have thought they were idealists.
I said, well, probably I've used it in the wrong sense, but we have ideals, we have values, morals, principles that guide us in what we do and how, I would hope would guide us in what we do and how we behave. Well, I want to come on in a minute to whether Marxism is a science, because that is, I think, something we really want to discuss. But what I'm suggesting at the moment is that to any suggestion that Marxists are crude materialists, that we don't have principles and morals, is wrong. And that's quite often a criticism which is levelled against communists and Marxists. Second point to go on to is dialectics, and I want to argue that dialectics is an approach to understanding how that material world works, whether it's the natural world or the world of humans. It starts from an understanding that nothing is ever fixed forever or static, that even things that appear to be fixed are at another level, as with atoms in metal, or the individuals in society, or the rocks of which the planet is concerned, is comprised, in a state of flux, and that the way things change is not just due to external forces acting on things, but is also the consequence of what are often internal mechanisms or contradictory processes within the things itself, whether that's a social structure or a physical thing, this table outside of human social relations. And to suggest that, like materialism, dialectics was embedded in science well before Marx, and one of the things that Marx and Engels both do is refer to recent developments in physics, especially in electromagnetism and thermodynamics. It's certainly embedded in geology and earth processes, because non-Darwinists like Lyell were very clear that the planet had been in a state of flux for a very long time. They weren't Marxists, of course, but that notion of internal processes producing the phenomena that we can see and understand was very much there in science well before Marx. And of course in evolutionary theory, and both Marx and Engels paid tribute to Darwin in producing a mechanism for evolution which was very much based upon the internal dynamics of animal and plant populations themselves, although they also had great difficulty, or rather differences, with Darwin's own ideas. Yeah? So I'm suggesting that what Marx did, and did, I think, this is his service to humanity, if you like, is to marry dialectics with materialism and apply them to human society, human structures, and to history, and to ideas. There's another quote from Marx that I just want to give you, and that's to do with commodities. We'll be looking at economics next week, but there's a passage in Capital where Marx talks about a commodity appearing at first sight to be a very trivial thing, easily understood, the table or the chair. You sit at it, you sit on it, or you eat at it. It's not problematic. But he says its analysis shows that commodities are in reality very queer things. They're abounding in what he says are metaphysical subtleties and theological niceties. And I'm always a bit confused by what metaphysics means, but what metaphysics does mean is the generalized set of theories about what exists and how we can know what exists. And so for Marx, one of those metaphysical subtleties that he's talking about are what Mary called last week the forces of production. Machinery, tools, equipment, technology, skills, land on which crops are grown, materials, resources, the supply chain, which includes not just how those resources are carried to the factory in the manufacture of commodities, but also how the waste products from our use of those commodities are discharged and effects on the planet, the forces of production. And those subtleties are also in the relations of production, the contradictions between capital and labour, between use value and exchange value. These were all terms that Mary introduced last week. Marx introduces the terms alienation, reification and fetishism, which sometimes seem obscure concepts, but the way in which workers, people, are removed from what was once or could be still theirs. Initially, of course, the products that they manufacture, but also their human relationships with their workforce, with other people in the community, etc. The way capitalism produces an alienated society, the way in which we make social relations into things. So I occupy a job, and that job is seen as something that I occupy, rather than what it really is, which is a set of social relations which are determined historically and have a huge mass of political issues associated with the job that I work at, if I'm lucky enough to have one. And fetishism, borrowed from anthropology, where Marx argued that we tend to elevate things into something which is much more than what they really are. We endow them with sort of semi-mystical qualities. And the photograph on the bottom right there, I took a couple of days ago. It's my local shop, the Penn Road Community Stores, and there's a picture of people who are very much realising themselves, de-alienating themselves because they brought LS shoes, yeah? And they say, my style is who I am, yeah? Now that, for me, is alienation, and it's the fetishism of commodities. And for Marx, the exploitation of people and the exploitation of nature and its consequences, which you know all too well today, went hand in hand. And those are all part of these relations of productions. So that is to do with Marx's analysis of commodity production and the way in which a dialectical approach, a materialist approach, can help us go beneath the surface appearance of things and look at their origins. Engels applied that to the appearance of humans themselves, where the possession of an opposable thumb and forefinger, the fact that we have a very high brain capacity to body weight, which is much more similar to juvenile primates than it is to the adults of most other primate species, the fact that we lack defensive mechanisms, we need to cooperate communally with our neighbours to survive, placed a premium on social development. And Engels argued that the emergence of Homo sapiens from other hominid pre-human species was not just a matter of genetic development, of Darwinian evolution, but also a matter of their own social evolution, that humans, beyond anything else, are social animals, and our evolution is social as well as physical. Again, I think the part played by labour in the transition from ape to human, ape to man, is one of the most amazing texts, even though in terms of modern science it's dated in detail. But the actual, all the evidence accumulates to show that we are a rather different species in many respects from other animals that occupy this planet. Okay. And the other point I'd like to make is simply to mention that or to suggest that when we're looking at phenomena and change, we need to look at the internal contradictions, and this is just referring to Mary's analysis of the transition from feudalism to capitalism, but also we need to look at the contingent factors which make every change different from every other change, because no revolutionary process, no process of social change is identical in every place in the world or identical at every time in history. They're all different, and contingent factors make a part of what makes, incidentally, a revolutionary party of some sort, in my view, necessary, because we need to know when the time is appropriate to undertake certain actions if we want to secure that kind of social change. So those internal contradictions which led to the transition to capitalism from feudalism were very different in different areas, in different places. And in Europe, for example, the Black Death was one of the, was an external factor in many ways, which hastened the emergence of wage labour from a feudal economy. They're all dynamic and they overlap. And then to say, also introduce this concept of base and superstructure, which I think is probably used, and this is a personal view, and I don't know if Mary agrees, probably used too much by Marxists. Technically, I guess, well, let's look at what Marx says. In the social production of their existence, humans enter into definite relations which are independent of their will, relations of production appropriate to the particular stage and development of the forces of production. The totality of these relations constitutes the economic structure of society, and the foundation on which arises a legal and political superstructure, and to which correspond definite forms of social consciousness. It's not the consciousness of humans that determines their existence, it's the social existence of humans which determines their consciousness. And I think that's absolutely right. That is the Marxist view of history. But it's led in some respects to this division between the economic base and the social ideological superstructure, which sometimes is presented as a rigid deterministic relationship rather than a set of relationships which are dynamically and dialectically interrelated. So for me, the superstructure-based terminology is limited to a degree. When people use it, I guess I know what they mean, but I think we always ought to use it being aware that there's a huge degree of overlap, and there are many things which if I were to ask you whether they fitted into the base or the superstructure, we'd probably argue about for ages, probably over a drink or two. Yeah? That's my view, and Mary and I will argue about this, no doubt, later on tonight. And there's a suggestion in the Q&A, which will go into the Morning Star after the next one, which mentions the term, I think, and one of the things you might like to look at is whether you think it's satisfactory or not. Okay. And then the other point, a couple more points before I finish, the dialectics of political struggle. Marx argued that dialectics were a key to understanding the way in which the material productive forces of society come into conflict with the relations of production. From forms of development of productive forces, these relations turn from their base into their fetters, things that are obstructing further development. Then begins an era of social revolution, which is Conrad at the back was suggesting, I think. These things take time. The changes in the foundation lead sooner or later to the transformation of the whole immense superstructure. And that's where the base and superstructure concept comes from. He did argue that no social order is ever destroyed before that all the productive forces for which it's sufficient have been developed, and new superior relations of production never replace older ones before the material conditions for their existence have matured within the framework of the old society. I think that's actually, a really interesting concept to discuss, particularly in relation to China, for example. Does China need to go through a capitalist phase before it achieves full socialism? Would China have survived today if it hadn't developed the forces of production within relatively traditional relations of production, at least within the factory, would it have just gone the way of many other social revolutions and been crushed? I mean, there's a whole range of issues to do with the way dialectics works out in society, particularly for those people who want to secure fundamental social change. And that's one of the areas where I think dialectics is really useful, trying to understand those relations between different elements and different forces within a social structure. And I think Mary will return to that later on. I'm an ecologist by training, and for me, one of the things that got me interested in Marx was the way in which you can see dialectical processes. I'm going to contradict myself in a minute and say it's not true, but I'll come to that in a minute. Dialectical processes are at work in nature. Because one of the things I spent most of my life doing was looking at the way that humans can manage natural habitats. And so if you look at the colonisation of exposed rock by lichens, the way in which the lichens break down the rock, the grasses then grow on the broken down rock, grasses lead to the accumulation of soil, soil provides a seedbed for shrubs, the shrubs grow, their roots break up the soil a little bit more, eventually you get trees coming in, you have that transition from bare rock to woodland, and the woodland here would be called the woodland climax because it supposedly is what arises in any given area, any given climatic regime after that process is complete through a whole range of processes which it's the business of ecologists to dissect. I won't go through them now because it would take time. Yeah, you want me to? All right, I'll go back and start again. But I mean, for me it's one of the most interesting things about ecology, the way in which those dialectical processes are at work. And you can look at it in ecosystem dynamics, which is what I'm interested in. You can see it in evolutionary processes, which I'm less conversant with. You can see it in a whole range of processes in the natural environment. And classically, they're dialectical processes. I'm going to contradict myself in a minute, but just to say, and in classical ecology, the same thing happens in a puddle or pool or stream, which begins to get silted up because submerged aquatic plants grow, they reduce the rate of water flow, sediment accumulates, you get either marsh or fen or bog, depending upon the climate and the kind of species which are colonising that area. That turns into what's called carr, which is wet woodland. Eventually you get a preclimax woodland and you get the woodland climax again. And that raises all sorts of really interesting questions to ecology. So, does everything converge on the same climatic climax? Or is what's in any area simply a combination of whatever happens to be around at the time? Are they stochastic processes, random processes involved, in which case could you have polyclimaxes, lots of different climatic regimes emerging at the same time? Teleology, yeah? Is there some inherent goal-directedness in nature which tends to lead to a certain endpoint? Lots of Marxists are teleological. In fact, quite a lot of what we say is teleological because we see the end result of human social behaviour as being, we hope, a communist society, as if it would go there automatically. Current ecological theory is going against teleology, rather, because random processes, we realise, these are the contingent factors that I was talking about earlier, are much more important. So all sorts of things in ecology sort of kind of manifest these dialectical processes. Another thing just to throw at you, mechanical materialism. I think that is a problem. And I think Marxists sometimes tend to be subject to it, and we should be careful of it. The notion that all changes, this is mechanical materialism, are the result of external influences, I think that's something we're probably not subject to because we're also dialectical in our approach. And mechanical materialism is a useful approach in physics. Newton's laws of motion were a classic example of mechanical materialism, but they are always partial. They led to the Concorde air crashes when it was found that there were dialectical processes, if you want, within the metals which comprise the aircraft wings, yeah? Metal fatigue. They led to... No, you're jumping up and down there.
Why is Newton's law of motion and mechanical material? Explain why Newton's law is
action and reaction are equal and opposite.
Okay.
Yeah?
Mm.
That's Newton's law.
Mm.
Action and reaction not always equal and opposite. Although we might...
Okay,
take that on board and go away with it.
Sorry.
Because we could actually argue about whether Newton's laws are mechanical. But I'd like to argue that they are. And I'd like to argue that mechanical materialism is always limited. The Tay Bridge disaster was another example. Afghanistan, in the invasion of Afghanistan, where it's thought you can just go in and bomb a country to hell and you'll achieve social change. Of course, we were the people who went into Afghanistan first when we tried to get rid of the Mujahideen in order to reduce the influence of the Soviet Union. Yeah? All of these things have not just unforeseen consequences, but totally unpredictable results. And in biology and society in particular, mechanical materialism, I would suggest, is politically suspect. And the classic example of that is the plethora of books that are coming out all the time on evolutionary psychology, human behaviour, which attribute human nature to basically primeval instincts, the effects of having spent X 100,000 years in the wilds supporting ourselves before the advent of, quote, civilization. It explains all phenomena in terms of processes at lower levels of society, that's mechanical. Margaret Thatcher said there's no such thing as society, just individuals and their families. And there is a trend in science which tends to go from individuals, explains society on the basis of the behaviour of individuals. Individuals are explained on the basis of their constituent organs, whether it's brain or heart and so on, in terms of cells, in terms of metabolic pathways, chemical reactions, eventually subatomic particles. I mean, we can discuss that as well if you like. One of the things about Marxist scientists, I think, is that they realise there are translation rules. There are translation rules. Am I talking absolute rubbish? People look at me totally bewildered. No? Between each of these levels. And part of being a Marxist scientist to understand what those rules are and how you can translate between the behaviour of, at a cellular level, and the behaviour of organs and individuals which are comprised of those cells. And and if you want to look at a clash between a Marxist biologist and a mechanical biologist, mechanical materialist, I can offer you no better example than going onto the web and just tapping in this tinyurl.com Rose Dawkins, and you will get a debate between Stephen Rose, who I hope will be speaking here in the autumn when we come to open the Bernal collection, and Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins is author of The Selfish Gene, for example. That's one amongst something like 20 books, which attributes human behaviour to our genetic constitution. I'll just throw something at you. Genes don't exist. And it's not me being idealist. Genes don't exist. If you want me to follow that up later, I will. Okay? So Stephen Rose, have a look at it. A couple of last points, and I'm going to shut up. Have we gone too long?
No, it's fantastic.
Yeah? Okay. Dialectics can also be used in a mechanical way as well. And this is where I probably am going to be controversial. Engels' laws, I love Engels. I think Engels is brilliant, virtually everything he's written. I think the way some of Engels' writings have been used is worrying. And one of those areas is the way that Engels quotes laws of dialectics, the unity and interpenetration of opposites, positive and negative electricity, workers and capitalists, the transformation of quantitative into qualitative changes, phase changes. Ice melts, you get water. Water heats, you get steam. Yeah? Classic dialectical processes. In every textbook on dialectics, the transition of phase changes from ice to water to steam will be there as an example of dialectical processes. And revolutionary struggle, of course, capitalism to socialism. And this weird one, the negation of the negation. And the example which is usually used is, butterfly, pupa, egg, or rather egg, pupa, butterfly. And that is sometimes related to Marx's use of the term metamorphosis, of course. I'm not sure they're helpful, because for me all of them look backwards at events and try to apply a fairly rigid interpretation of dialectics to a complex set of events which we should have been looking at in their complexity rather than trying to explain them on the basis of supposed laws. I won't go on to sort of later developers of dialectics, Lenin, Stalin and Mao, They're all really interesting to look at. I'm not sure that they add a great deal to our understanding of how the universe works. My last point, last slide. For me, dialectics is what I call a heuristic, a useful rule of thumb which stops you taking on board truths which are given to you without asking questions. Dialectics is an approach which helps you to question everything. Engels argued that modern materialism is essentially dialectical and no longer needs any philosophy standing above the other sciences. And he meant Marxism as well. Yeah? Because as soon as each separate science is required to get clarity as to its position in the great totality of things, and you can begin to develop links between different sciences and begin to understand how the universe works, a special science dealing with this totality is superfluous. This is Engels. We don't need this science of dialectics once we've got to the stage where we can understand scientifically how the real world works. Engels also argues in Anti-Düring that people thought dialectically long before they knew what dialectics was, just as they spoke prose long before the term prose existed. Okay? So for me, dialectics it's not common sense. It takes an effort. But it is also not something esoteric, only available to the knowledgeable, to the initiated. It's something which we all can use, and we probably do use a lot in our day-to-day lives. So that's, yeah, am I not over time, am I? No. Okay. So let me end with the 11th thesis, yeah? The purpose of philosophy is to change it. Yeah? And to ask why it is that individuals found it necessary to desecrate Marx's tomb in that way. For me, the answer is because dialectical materialism, Marxism, is a danger to people. It's a danger to vested interests, and it's particularly a danger to people who don't share, if you like, the ideals that I would imagine we all share in this room. Okay, that's my bit. Mary and I have devised some questions.
Let them see if I've got any questions for you first.
Yeah. Do you want to ask them or shall I?
No.
Has anyone got questions for me first? Right. So, any points before we go on to the group work?
There must be questions. This was very, especially about the science.
I haven't.
Ask them.
Yeah, carry on.
I can understand from your explanation is that historical materialism and also the dialectical materialism is another work of scientific socialism.
Right. Can you hear at the back? Whether historical materialism, dialectical materialism is another word for scientific socialism. I want to throw that back at you. Because one of the things I'd like 2 or 3 people just to get together to discuss is Marxism scientific? Can socialism be scientific? And if the answer to that is yes, what do we mean by scientific socialism? Do we mean science in the same way as do we mean science as in every other science, particularly the physical sciences? Or is there something else that we mean by scientific socialism? So I'm not going to answer that. I want you to answer it. I do have my own answer to it, and I'll give you my answer to it. But if we could just wait until the groups have had a bit of a chance to discuss that question, because I think it's a really, really important one.
Yeah. Well, the answer to the first question.
No. You're going to.
I thought we were asking the question.
No, we're not.
I'm going to say that
Either.
Just the same, because I've listened patiently for 3/4 of an hour, and so socialism is scientific.
No, Ivor, I'm going to stop you. No, Ivor, these are the questions.
Oh, I see.
No, Ivor, listen to me. Ivor, listen to me a minute. These are questions that we're going to ask you to answer.
Well, I'll answer one of them
Yeah,
for
but
you.
we're going to do it in groups, Ivor.
You should be very grateful, Mary.
Thank you very much, Ivor. Thank you very much indeed, honestly. But I'd like you to share this with other people because everybody wants to hear it. I only asked whether or not there were any questions to this man here, but yes.
I have a question, but it might be too big. I mean, you threw in the discussion the fact that genes don't exist.
Yeah.
Well, that's the first I've ever heard of that, because we use
I'm prepared to defend that assertion that genes don't exist. But and it's going to sound okay. It's going to sound like I'm copying out again. But the second question here is quotes man a naked ape, but is the answer in our genes?
Right, okay, so we wait.
My answer to that, I'll give you my answer,
No, not yet.
is
Let me
no for 2 reasons, but I won't give you the reasons for that. But I'd like you to, in groups, answer that. Okay, so there's going to be a group at the front, if you like. Is Marxism, can Marxism be scientific? Another group at the back?
Do it in that way.
Okay.
So I'm going to give you a number, right, and you're going to be...
Okay, hang on, just see if there's any more points.
Sorry.
Any more questions?
Yeah, I think I disagree with a lot of what you've said.
Good.
Not as a scholar, because I wouldn't claim to be an expert on Marx, but as an academic. And I think that all the complexity...
Is this bloke got a special permission? He goes on for bloody hours,
He's
the man with the beard.
Ivor!
Shut him up.
Ivor! He's asking...
No.
Ivor!
Is he a friend of yours, Mary? I'm sorry if he is.
Ivor, do you want to go? This is...
People are
Ivor,
naturally
stop it.
favourable
Stop it.
treatment from their
Ivor,
friends.
stop.
Come on,
No, well, listen to him.
man with a beard, he speaks up for bloody hours.
Right, we're having questions,
Right.
not statements. Right,
Well,
from the
just
back.
We'll leave it to this.
Yeah,
Leave it to discussion, okay?
I'm going to give you a number, and you're going to get into groups according to the number. Okay. Ivor, you're number 1. You're number 2.
You've always been my
You're
number 1.
number 3, and that's okay. And you're 1 and 2.
Should we stick with 4?
And 3, Lee. Oh, should we have 4? A 4. Okay.
Yeah. 1, 2,
Done
3,
4.
4.
And then 1, 2, 3, 4 at the back. So can you get into those? Number 1s get together. Number 2s get together. Number 3s get together. Number 4s get together.
Okay, so number 1's at the bottom here, in the front. Number 2's in the middle, and then 3s and 4s towards the back. Is that okay?
Number 1.
Ivor's number 1. All number 1s join Ivor.
Right.